Hello and welcome to another episode of Stable Diffusion for professional creatives. Today we'll be looking at ways to integrate Adobe Mixamo inside of our ComfyUI workflows. If you haven't done any 3D work, you might not be familiar with Adobe Mixamo. Mixamo is basically a library of characters and poses and actions really that is created by Adobe. We can see here at the top of the page we have either characters or animations. And while I am not that interested in characters in this tutorial because I want to be able to generate a new character inside of Stable Diffusion without a base template, I am interested in the animations panel. And why is that? That's because an animation has a lot of different poses to it. If we think about it, we have a slightly different pose for each frame of the animation, and that's kind of powerful. Also, we are looking at a 3D space instead of a 2D space, so we can also move the cameras around. And by integrating all of that, animations, frames, camera angles, we can create a ton of different new poses that then we can use as reference inside of ComfyUI and Stable Diffusion. So for this tutorial, I'm going to use the base template we have here, this blank human-like figure that we have on the right. And I'm going to search for, let's say, a jump animation. Here we can see all the different jumps we have access to. In my case, I'm going to go with this one, the mutant jumping, and we can see that our default character immediately starts performing the animation. The next thing I'm going to do is stop the animation and then select a frame that I like for posing. Let's say I'm going to go with this one. Now this pose is not that interesting from this angle, but since we are in a 3D space, we can just move it around and see if we like it from other angles. Now I'm not so sure about this frame in particular, so I am going to try and see if there's any other frames that I might like. Or, for example, we can just change the animation altogether if we're not sure about it. So let's go, for example, for a standing animation. And I'm going to select this one. By changing the angle, selecting a different frame, we can see that we have a ton of different poses and possibilities. So let's say I wanted to go with this pose, this sort of hero-like pose. Now there's two ways I can integrate this pose inside of our ComfyUI workflow. The first one, which is the simplest, is just by grabbing a screenshot of this pose and then importing it into Photoshop for later compositing. The second one, which is the hardest one, if you're not used to it at least, is downloading the whole animation and then importing it inside of a 3D render program, like Blender for example. Each one of these different choices has its pros and cons. For example, if we just screenshot this pose, we cannot change the lighting, but it's faster to get a resulting image that we can use. Or if we decide on using Blender, we can just change pretty much about anything about this particular pose and character, such as lighting, material, depth of field, point of view, focal length, anything. But let's start with the Photoshop approach. I'm going to screenshot and I am going to load it inside of Photoshop. And then if you followed my previous tutorials, you know that there's already a very easy way to integrate images in Photoshop inside of a ComfyUI workflow. So we're going to do just that. We are going to load a checkpoint. We're going to use sdxl Lightning for this one. I'm going to use Juggernaut XL version 9 Lightning. You'll be able to find a download link in the description below. I'm going to drag and drop from model over to a case sampler node, and then I'm going to drag and drop from clip and create two different clip text encodes for our positive and negative prompt field. The top one will be our positive and our bottom one will be our negative. Then I am going to input the steps that we need for the lightning model, which is going to be 8, the CFG, which is going to be 1.5, the sampler name, which is going to be DPMPP2MSDE, and the scheduler, which is going to be SGM uniform. Now this workflow is an image-to-image workflow, but where is the image coming from? Well, that's coming from a Photoshop to ComfyUI node. If you want to know more about this node, you can go check out a previous tutorial that I have made about this node. You can find it either here or in the description below. What this node does basically is take the active image in Photoshop and bring it over to ComfyUI. by using a Photoshop connection, and that connection has to be enabled inside of Photoshop. I'm going to show you later how to do that, and the password has to be the same as the one in this password field. Then we need to resize the image because we didn't know specifically if the image is big enough or small enough to actually be usable in ComfyUI. So we're going to drag and drop and search for resize and resize it to say 512 by 512. And then we're going to search for a VAE encode node. Connect the image to pixels, the VAE to the VAE from the load checkpoint node, and then latent to latent. Then we are going to drag and drop from latent, select VAE decode, connect the VAE again from the load checkpoint node, and then drag and drop from image and select preview image. And there we go. We have a very quick and simple image-to-image workflow starting from a Photoshop image and ending in a Stable Diffusion generated image. Now, if you want to keep it this simple, you might want to lower the denoise a bit, because at 1 it's going to give you a completely different image than the source images. But hey, we are using a humanoid figure, so we can use a ControlNet Openpose, for example. So we're going to search for apply ControlNet, drag and drop from the ControlNet input and select ControlNet loader. We are going to select Openpose, and then we're going to search for the Openpose pose node. We're going to input the resized image, and then we're going to put the image inside of the apply ControlNet node. Another kind of ControlNet we might want to use is the depth ControlNet. So we are going to Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V on our ControlNet nodes. We're going to select a depth model, and then we're going to search for a depth anything node. Again, we're going to drag and drop the image from the resize node into the depth anything node and connect the depth anything node to the depth ControlNet. The last thing that we want to do is drag and drop from the positive conditioning over to our ControlNet for Openpose, and then from that one to our ControlNet for depth, and then drag and drop the conditioning from depth into the positive field in the K-sampler. Another thing that we want to do is lower the strength a bit. So let's go, say, to 0.7 and 0.7. For now, let's leave the prompt fields empty and go over to Photoshop and establish the connection. So we want to go over to Edit over here, Remote Connections, and then Enable Remote Connections. Here, in the password field, we're going to input our password that we have in the Photoshop to ComfyUI node. In our case, that's 12341234, and press Enter. Another thing that we want to do is resize the image so that it's square, because we're working with a square image. Then, the last thing we want to do, just in order to check the results of our generations beside our original image inside of Photoshop, is drag and drop from the image output in the VAE decode node and search for pop-up. The preview pop-up node will create a pop-up that can stay beside our original image inside of Photoshop, so that we don't have to go back and forth to see the results. Then we go over to our ComfyUI menu, click on Extra Options and click on Auto Queue. What this will do is it will continuously generate new images while we're working inside of Photoshop. If we want to keep the image from generating again and again and again without us making any changes and thus changing the overall results, we can go over to our K-sampler and instead of randomized, select fixed. This way, if nothing changes, everything is going to stay the same. If the source image changes, then the resulting image will be different. So now, let's hit Q prompt and see what happens. And there we go. I just had some issues with Photoshop connection, so I had to restart PC, and I added some troubleshooting preview images over here to check that everything was working correctly, but we get an image. Albeit bad, but we get an image. So now that we have established a connection and we can see from the debugging that it's sourcing the image from Photoshop and then it's getting the Openpose skeleton and the depth map, we want to try and see what happens when we actually input some prompts. You can see that it keeps going and going and going. So what about an action photo of a man kneeling down inside a crater? Cinematic lighting, rain falling amidst the remnant of a destroyed city. Yep, we can see that we get a very interesting result just from a quick screen grab imported into Photoshop. Now, if we bring the pop-up beside our original image and pin it in place, we can just start working on our subject here. So let's say we add a level, and then we can start drawing some other things that may be beside him or in the back. So let's say we want to isolate the subject, duplicate it, bring it forward, and then on another back layer, we want to have some of the city and the cityscape that we prompt about. We can see that it keeps generating more and more, and it tries to preserve the overall composition that we are putting into place live inside of Photoshop. So if we want, we can keep refining it more and more and more. So overall, this is, I think, a very powerful way to try and recreate poses that would prove difficult to properly implement without reference images, without actually constructing an Openpose skeleton that would work for us. I think that, at least in my experience, trying to control a skeleton is a lot more difficult than just trying to take stills from an already existing animation. Now let's stop our ComfyUI workflow for a second, and let's try the second approach, the one with Blender. So let's go back to Adobe Mixamo and select Download. We will have a few choices here, but the default ones are good enough for us since we are going to use still images. If you're going for an animation, and you can do that using animated diff, for example, you might want to change these settings a bit, depending on, for example, the number of frames per second you want. So I'm going to download the FBX file. I am going to place it in a download folder of our choosing, and then we're going to open Blender. Here we're going to delete the default cube as usual, as is tradition, and then we're going over to File, Import, FBX, and we're going to look for the FBX that we just downloaded. For me, that's standing.fbx, and there it is. So if we drag and drop on the timeline down here, we can see that we have the whole animation playing. And then we can just select one frame that we like. Or if we're using animated diff, for example, to generate an animation, we can just let it play and render frame by frame, which then we can use inside of Stable Diffusion as reference. So let's say I want to stop at this frame, and then the next thing I want to do is just tweak the settings a bit to render something in the way that I like to. So I'm going to switch from Eevee to Cycles. There are two different render engines. And I'm going to select GPU compute. Then I'm going over and select the viewport shading option. That is going to give me a close to real-time preview of the actual render that I'm going to have. I am going to disable the armature view because I don't care for that in my final render. At least I don't care about seeing it. And I am going to delete the key light that we have now. Being a photographer, I don't really like the default key lights. What I'm going to do instead is search for an area light, which is closer to what I normally use in the studio. Bring it over here, tweak the settings a bit. Let's say I want to go up to 40 watts. I want to have a really cinematic shot. So I am going to have a light from the top and maybe another area light from the side. So I'm going to rotate it y-axis, let's say 90 degrees. Move it over here, and then going up to, let's say, 30 watts. You see the light now is much more interesting than the one that we already had by default with Adobe Mixamo. Then I'm going to select everything and the armor. That is very important, otherwise it won't work. And move it up on the Z-axis. And then let's say I want to have this character stand on top of some rubbles. I am going to search for a cube, and I'm going to use that as sort of a platform. And then I'm going to add some more cubes. I'm going to reduce their sizes a bit. I'm going to rotate them and bring them up and scatter them a bit around. I'm going to duplicate that, move that around, do the same again until I am satisfied with the results. And let's say I want to have a big circle kind of thing. So let's say a torus in the background, just like that. I'm going to remove the view for the armature again so that it doesn't distract me. And then I am going to change the material for the cube to an emission material. So there's some light coming from down here as well. I'm going to change the torus to emission material as well. That's pretty cool if you ask me. And then I'm going to change the position of the camera to the one from the viewport that we have right now by pressing Ctrl, Alt, and 0. Now selecting the camera, I'm going to change a few settings. Let's say I want to have a bit of a deeper focal length. And I'm going to change the render settings to 512 by 512. I'm going to shift the camera upwards a bit, and let's say I want to go in a bit more with my focal length. And there we go. We have our overall composition. What we can do now is just render the image. Maybe you can change the samples because I don't need 4,000 samples for a scene this simple. And then I'm going over to Image, Save As, and I'm going to save this image as a reference. And then I am going back to ComfyUI. We can either use the same setup and import the image that we had just rendered inside of Photoshop, or we can just load the image inside of ComfyUI. So in that case, we could just replace the Photoshop to ComfyUI node to a load image node. But since I want to be able to maybe change a few things in the composition later on in Photoshop, let's do that with Photoshop instead of loading the image directly inside of ComfyUI. So I'm going to bring the image that we just rendered into Photoshop, and I'm going to start the workflow again. You can see that it's updating. We have our preview image here, that is the one that has been sourced from Photoshop, the new Openpose reference, and the new depth reference. And the resulting image is very close to the one that we were having inside of Photoshop, but with a bit more oomph. And that's because we set up the whole scene inside of Blender. And then we can just keep changing the prompt or adding stuff in Photoshop. So let's say we want to have, for example, an action photo of a Templar knight kneeling down in the middle of a battle. Cinematic lighting, the sun rising from behind the dunes. And we can see how the workflow keeps reacting in close to real time to what we are using as prompts, but by keeping the overall composition and lighting that we had input inside of Blender. This to me is incredibly useful and powerful because by setting up a very simple scene in Blender, we don't have to care about materials, we don't have to care about details, we don't have to care about anything that we would normally care about setting a scene for an actual render. We can just input the basic layout, the basic subjects of our workflow, and then let Stable Diffusion handle all the rest. So I hope you can find some good uses for this workflow. To me specifically, I have always been kind of wary of using 3D softwares because of all the steep learning curves that you have to face in terms of rigging, in terms of materials, in terms of shaders, in terms of rendering. Whereas with this kind of workflow, you just need to set up a scene and then forget about anything else that should happen inside of the 3D app. And while of course it's not as precise as actually building a scene inside of Blender, and I mean from start to finish, from actual composition to the actual material that you're going to use, it allows us to take the strengths of a tool like Blender in terms of composition and then transpose them into an easy to use workflow inside of ComfyUI. So we kind of get the best of both worlds here. I can definitely see some good use cases for this workflow in terms of creating concept arts for the early stages of a project, or for creating reference images as well, or for just brainstorming ideas that you can then later refine in a more defined workflow. If you think of a more complex workflow where creating a scene is step 1 and generating the first images is step 2, then we can have a step 3 when we refine the images, step 4 where we can upscale the image, and then we can have a step 5 for polishing. So we're just at step 2 here. But same as always with generative AI, it's not about letting the machine do all the work, it's about helping you out in a workflow that you already have. It's about finding ways to integrate the new tech in your already existing workflows for your already existing use cases as well. And that's going to be all for today. I hope you had fun. My name is Andrea Baioni. You can find me on Instagram at risunobushi or on the web at andreabaioni.com. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. This helps a lot since this is a relatively new channel, and I'll be seeing you next week.